I'm not sure I disagree with Rick, but I'm going to try to make trouble, as is my job. And my remarks, at least based on yesterday's sessions, may be alarmingly brief, but that's not to be taken as an indication of my respect for his paper. I think it's a terrific paper. Rick is testing the possibility that we can defend a kind of inferential internalism, turn back skepticism, and avoid the regress problem by embracing a Keynesian approach. If we know directly propositions of the form E makes probable P, and we are justified in believing E, then we may be justified in believing and know that P on this basis. I'll focus my comments on three things. One, the Keynesian approach. Two, inferential internalism. And three, the regress problem. First, the Keynesian approach. How plausible is it? Does it kick up more dust than with the solution to the problem than is in the air from the problem itself? Early on, Russell himself expressed concerns about Keynesian probability judgments. He said, quote, "Keynes does not contend that his probability relations are tautologies. How then can they be known?" Russell went on to clarify that he was not saying that they could not be known, but he wondered both what kinds of things Keynesian probabilities are and how they can be known. This was especially perplexing when it required knowing propositions of the form proposition P is conditional on the evidence A, probable to degree A, when the expression A was not a number on a Keynesian view. Keynes did not believe his probability judgments admitted a numerical measure. In the end, Russell could only make sense of Keynes by saying that his theory must be taken with regard to probability judgments as relations between propositional functions and not propositions proper. Of course, Frank Ramsey gave the most skeptical view of Keynes' approach, saying, and I quote, "But let us now turn to a more fundamental criticism of Mr. Keynes' views, which is the obvious one that there really do not seem to be any such things as the probability relations he describes. He supposes that at any rate in certain cases they can be perceived. But speaking for myself, I feel confident that this is not true. I do not perceive them. And if I am to be persuaded that they exist, it must be by argument. Moreover, I shrewdly suspect that others do not perceive them either, because they are able to come to so very little agreement as to which of them relates any two given propositions." But what of Rick's examples of probability propositions that we are to directly intuit? Let's examine them. First, Rick mentions enumerative induction, though I think you may have cut that out of this version. It's true that enumerative inductive probability that A's are B's or an A will be B increases with the number of observed A's that are B's. Now, part of your approach is to thwart skepticism, but the skeptic's not going to give you a priori access to the enumeration. But the question about enumerative induction is which theory of probability best explains this. Russell himself, for instance, claimed that to be useful, probability statements proclaim matters of fact, and that made the frequency theories more or less inevitable in his view. Second, Rick considers the connection between propositions that I seem to remember having an experience and the proposition that I had the experience. Or he asks whether it's plausible that there is a synthetic necessary truth of the sort that one seems to see some physical object that is red and round. That makes it likely that there is some object that is red and round. Rick asks, how plausible is it to suppose that there are necessary truths, asserting that our putative evidence in the above examples makes at least prima facie probable the conclusion? The answer certainly could be not very. Consider one of Russell's delightful examples in another part of where he wasn't talking about Keynes. And this has got to be autobiographical, so it's somewhat humorous. He also talked about an example I'm not going to talk about, is a traveler who gets fleas. and then later has an itching sensation, and he couldn't tell whether it was the fleas this time or not. This was about tea. He says, by mistake, you make tea in a pot that has contained vinegar. The result is appalling. You rinse the pot and try again. Still, the offensive flavor is unmistakable. After a second rinsing, you are doubtful whether you still taste the vinegar. After a third, you are sure you do not. Now, in other examples of the same type, Russell admits that this process goes through, quote, varying stages of doubt. How could the probability judgment about the relation of tasting vinegar in one's tea, given one seeming to taste vinegar in one's tea, be a priori? The strength of the probability judgment seems to be conditioned on much empirical knowledge, such as the vinegar in one's teapot, that vinegar in one's teapot gives off a horrible taste, and changing conditions such as that the taste of vinegar diminishes over time with the washing of the pot. Indeed, all of Rick's examples seem to be conditioned on empirical factors and background knowledge, leaving me to wonder how plausible is the Keynesian approach to the a priori nature of probability judgments. Well, what of Rick's appeal to the demon world switching kinds of examples that are offered against reliabilism? When I first was thinking this, I was thinking Richard Foley's kind of example where you're in a regular environment and then you're switched instantaneously without knowing it. If world switching doesn't count against justified beliefs there, how can it count against Keynesian direct knowledge of probabilities? In the switching cases, we start in the non-demon world, where presumably our cognitive apparatus has been tuned largely to truth in demon-free environments. After the switch, the work of the demon is hidden from us. Beliefs still seem justified because we still seem, for all we can tell, to be in the demon-free environment, though we are not. But if we began our cognitive histories in the demon environments, what would seem justified would depend completely on what the demon feeds in. Our brains would tune, so to speak, to the regularities or irregularities in the demon world. And who knows what probability relations might seem strong in such a world. So I'm thinking, for example, in the normal switching cases, you're cognitively tuned to the probability relations in the regular world. But suppose you had a neural network as a model of the mind. And then you were wondering, well, what would it seem like to a neural network in a demon environment? Well, it wouldn't seem like anything until you trained up the neural network and had it to be conscious. Then the question is, well, what probability assessments would such a neural network make when it became conscious? Well, it would depend on what sorts of backpropagation you put into it, and what sorts of nodes that you strengthen, and what sorts of nodes that you weaken and inhibited, and so on. So who knows what you're going to come up with until you are the demon. You're the one who's introducing the backpropagation. Now, why think that there's going to be one set of Keynesian probability adjustments for any neural network, no matter how it's trained up? It seems to me that Rick needs that. There would just be one set. Perhaps in the demon situation, if something looks red and round, it's a good bet that it will not seem red and round upon closer inspection, depending upon what the demon does. It might, but it might not. And if it does, then isn't this because the demon is making the inputs conform to the correlations between seemings and apparent reality in a way similar to that of the non-demon world? I do not see how we can know a priori what type of demon we would be dealing with, and what regularities he or she would like for us to come to appreciate. So there may be some artificiality in the way that the demon switching cases have been presented up to now. Second, inferential internalism. Rick seems to accept Humer's point that Rick's earlier attempt to defend inferential internalism may have been too weak because the examples and arguments were enthymematic. Rick now states a supposed non-enthymematic argument for inferential internalism. It's a full entailment example, not a probabilistic or partial entailment example. S believes E and is thereby caused to believe P. E entails P, but the entailment is far too complicated for us to understand. And so Rick asks, unless S sees that P follows from E, and would we really allow that the inference in question generate a justified belief? Now, I confess that this seems to me like the correct thing to say about this example. But isn't Rick committed to the stronger position that even if S understood the entailment, S would still need some justification for thinking his understanding was correct, and that the entailment was genuine and not merely apparent? I think he is so committed. And if we tack this stronger constraint on inferential internalism, and if many types of knowledge or justified belief require this stronger constraint, I worry that we will have raised the bar so high that only quite sophisticated cognitive agents will be able to know or be justified in believing almost anything. I guess I'm wondering if Rick's view passes the old infants and animals test. Now, I think there are people in this room who would say no, and it shouldn't. Animal knowledge, they might say, is the cheap and uninteresting kind. Scientific knowledge is the only kind worthy of philosophical pursuit. And so be it if infants, even pre-adolescents, are excluded. Still, I worry the bar is being raised too high. My dog seems to know when I'm home. Infants seem to know when their mothers are holding them. And as we heard yesterday, even to know something about object permanence, if so-called looking preference experiments are to be believed. But it's highly unlikely that infants and animals are practicing Keynesian inferential internals. Lastly, the regress. Finally, Rick believes that directly apprehending propositions of the form E makes P probable to degree D will stop the regress of inferential internalism. I confess that I'm not sure it can do that. If I directly intuit that it's highly probable that there are more than 5 people in the room, since it seems to me that there are more than 5 people in the room, then I obtain some sort of support for that probability judgment. Still, will I not need some reason to think my cognitive capacity for direct apprehension of Keynesian probability is working to be justified in believing that E makes P probable? Don't I have to be justified in thinking my direct apprehension of such probability is truth conducive? As Keith Lehrer might put it, won't I have to put trust in my ability to directly apprehend Keynesian probability? And won't I have to place trust in my so trusting myself? For Lehrer, there's a loop of self-trust that takes the place of the usual regress. But will we not face this sort of issue? If we buy into Rick's brand of inferential internalism, where we have to turn the searchlight of justification not only on E's making P probable, but also on our justification for thinking that E makes P probable, will we not face an issue like that of Lehrer's self-trust? I think we will, and if not, I'd like to hear why not.